This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Michelle Crandall, Fremont, California, July 2006. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, Chapter 6, Vauxhall. I know that the tune I am piping is a very mild one, although there are some terrific chapters coming presently, and must beg the good-natured reader to remember that we are only discoursing at present about a stockbroker's family in Russell Square, who are taking walks, or luncheon, or dinner, or talking and making love as people do in common life, and without a single passionate and wonderful incident to mark the progress of their loves. The argument stands thus. Osborne, in love with Amelia, has asked an old friend to dinner and to Vauxhall. Joe Sedley is in love with Rebecca. Will he marry her? That is the great subject now in hand. We might have treated this subject in the genteel, or in the romantic, or in the facetious manner. Suppose we had laid the scene in Grosvenor Square, with the very same adventures. Would not some people have listened? Suppose we had shown how Lord Joseph Sedley fell in love, and the Marquis of Osborne became attached to Lady Amelia, with the full consent of the Duke, her noble father. Or, instead of the supremely genteel, suppose we had resorted to the entirely low, and described what was going on in Mr. Sedley's kitchen, how Black Sambo was in love with the cook, as indeed he was, and how he fought a battle with the coachman in her behalf, how the knife-boy was caught stealing a cold shoulder of mutton, and Miss Sedley's new femme de chambre refused to go to bed without a wax candle. Such incidents might be made to provoke much delightful laughter, and be supposed to represent scenes of life. Or if, on the contrary, we had taken a fancy for the terrible, and made the lover of the new femme de chambre a professional burglar, who bursts into the house with his band, slaughters Black Sambo at the feet of his master, and carries off Amelia in her night-dress, not to be let loose again till the third volume, we should easily have constructed a tale of thrilling interest, through the fiery chapters of which the reader should hurry, panting. But my readers must hope for no such romance, only a homely story, and must be content with a chapter about Vauxhall, which is so short that it scarcely deserves to be called a chapter at all. And yet it is a chapter, and a very important one too. Are not there little chapters in everybody's life, that seem to be nothing, and yet affect all the rest of the history? Let us then step into the coach with the Russell Square party, and be off to the gardens. There is barely room between Jos and Miss Sharp, who are on the front seat. Mr. Osborne sitting bodkin opposite, between Captain Dobbin and Amelia. Every soul in the coach agreed that on that night Jos would propose to make Rebecca Sharp Mrs. Sedley. The parents at home had acquiesced in the arrangement, though, between ourselves, old Mr. Sedley had a feeling very much akin to contempt for his son. He said he was vain, selfish, lazy, and effeminate. He could not endure his airs as a man of fashion, and laughed heartily at his pompous braggadocio stories. "I shall leave the fellow half my property," he said, "and he will have besides plenty of his own. But as I am perfectly sure that if you, and I, and his sister were to die to-morrow, he would say, 'Good gad!' and eat his dinner just as well as usual, I am not going to make myself anxious about him. Let him marry whom he likes. It's no affair of mine." Amelia, on the other hand, as became a young woman of her prudence and temperament, was quite enthusiastic for the match. Once or twice Jos had been on the point of saying something very important to her, to which she was most willing to lend an ear, but the fat fellow could not be brought to unbosom himself of his great secret, and very much to his sister's disappointment he only rid himself of a large sigh, and turned away. This mystery served to keep Amelia's gentle bosom in a perpetual flutter of excitement. If she did not speak with Rebecca on the tender subject, she compensated herself with long and intimate conversations with Mrs. Blenkinsop, the housekeeper, who dropped some hints to the lady's maid, who may have cursorily mentioned the matter to the cook, who carried the news, I have no doubt, to all the tradesmen, so that Mr. Joseph's marriage was now talked of by a very considerable number of persons in the Russell Square world. It was, of course, Mrs. Sedley's opinion that her son would demean himself by a marriage with an artist's daughter. "But lor, ma'am," ejaculated Mrs. Blenkinsop, "we was only grocers when we married Mr. S., who was a stockbroker's clerk, and we hadn't £500 among us, and we're rich enough now." And Amelia was entirely of this opinion, to which, gradually, the good-natured Mrs. Sedley was brought. Mr. Sedley was neutral. "Let Jos marry whom he likes," he said. "It's no affair of mine. This girl has no fortune, no more had Mrs. Sedley. She seems good-humoured and clever, and will keep him in order, perhaps. Better she, my dear, than a black Mrs. Sedley, and a dozen of mahogany grandchildren." So that everything seemed to smile upon Rebecca's fortunes. She took Jos's arm as a matter of course on going to dinner. She had sat by him on the box of his open carriage, a most tremendous buck he was, as he sat there serene, in state, driving his greys, and though nobody said a word on the subject of the marriage, everybody seemed to understand it. All she wanted was the proposal, and how Rebecca now felt the want of a mother, a dear tender mother who would have managed the business in 10 minutes, and in the course of a little delicate confidential conversation would have extracted the interesting avowal from the bashful lips of the young man. Such was the state of affairs as the carriage crossed Westminster Bridge. The party was landed at the Royal Gardens in due time. As the majestic Jos stepped out of the creaking vehicle, the crowd gave a cheer for the fat gentleman, who blushed and looked very big and mighty, as he walked away with Rebecca under his arm. George, of course, took charge of Amelia. She looked as happy as a rose-tree in sunshine. "I say, Dobbin," says George, "just look to the shawls and things, there's a good fellow." And so, while he paired off with Miss Sedley, and Jos squeezed through the gate into the gardens with Rebecca at his side, honest Dobbin contented himself by giving an arm to the shawls, and by paying at the door for the whole party. He walked very modestly behind them. He was not willing to spoil sport. About Rebecca and Jos he did not care a fig, but he thought Amelia worthy even of the brilliant George Osborne, and as he saw that good-looking couple threading the walks to the girl's delight and wonder, he watched her artless happiness with a sort of fatherly pleasure. Perhaps he felt that he would have liked to have something on his own arm besides a shawl. The people laughed at seeing the gawky young officer carrying this female burthen. But William Dobbin was very little addicted to selfish calculation at all, and so long as his friend was enjoying himself, how should he be discontented? And the truth is, that of all the delights of the gardens, of the 100,000 extra lamps, which were always lighted, the fiddlers in cocked hats, who played ravishing melodies under the gilded cockle-shell in the midst of the gardens, the singers, both of comic and sentimental ballads, who charmed the ears there, the country dances, formed by bouncing cockneys and cockneyesses, and executed amidst jumping, thumping, and laughter, the signal which announced that Madame Saqui was about to mount skyward on a slack rope ascending to the stars, the hermit that always sat in the illuminated hermitage, the dark walks, so favourable to the interviews of young lovers, the pots of stout handed about by the people in the shabby old liveries, and the twinkling boxes, in which the happy feasters made believe to eat slices of almost invisible ham, of all these things, and of the gentle Simpson, that kind smiling idiot, who I dare say presided even then over the place, Captain William Dobbin did not take the slightest notice. He carried about Amelia's white cashmere shawl, and having attended under the gilt cockle-shell, while Mrs. Salmon performed the Battle of Borodino, a savage cantata against the Corsican upstart who had lately met with his Russian reverses, Mr. Dobbin tried to hum it as he walked away, and found he was humming the tune which Amelia Sedley sang on the stairs as she came down to dinner. He burst out laughing at himself, for the truth is, he could sing no better than an owl. It is to be understood, as a matter of course, that our young people, being in parties of 2 and 2, made the most solemn promises to keep together during the evening, and separated in 10 minutes afterwards. Parties at Vauxhall always did separate, but 'twas only to meet again at supper time, when they could talk of their mutual adventures in the interval. What were the adventures of Mr. Osborne and Miss Amelia? That is a secret. But be sure of this, they were perfectly happy and correct in their behaviour, and as they had been in the habit of being together any time these 15 years, their tête-à-tête offered no particular novelty. But when Miss Rebecca Sharp and her stout companion lost themselves in a solitary walk, in which there were not above 50 more of couples similarly straying, they both felt that the situation was extremely tender and critical, and now or never was the moment, Miss Sharp thought, to provoke that declaration which was trembling on the timid lips of Mr. Sedley. They had previously been to the panorama of Moscow, where a rude fellow, treading on Miss Sharp's foot, caused her to fall back with a little shriek into the arms of Mr. Sedley, and this little incident increased the tenderness and confidence of that gentleman to such a degree that he told her several of his favourite Indian stories over again, for at least the 6th time. "How I should like to see India!" said Rebecca. "Should you?" said Joseph, with a most killing tenderness, and was no doubt about to follow up this artful interrogatory by a question still more tender, for he puffed and panted a great deal, and Rebecca's hand, which was placed near his heart, could count the feverish pulsations of that organ, when, oh provoking, the bell rang for the fireworks, and a great scuffling and running taking place, these interesting lovers were obliged to follow in the stream of people. Captain Dobbin had some thoughts of joining the party at supper, as, in truth, he found the Vauxhall amusements not particularly lively, but he paraded twice before the box where the now united couples were met, and nobody took any notice of him. Covers were laid for 4. The mated parties were prattling away quite happily, and Dobbin knew he was as clean forgotten as if he had never existed in this world. "I should only be de trop," said the captain, looking at them rather wistfully. "I'd best go and talk to the hermit." And so he strolled off out of the hum of men, and noise, and clatter of the banquet, into the dark walk, at the end of which lived that well-known pasteboard solitary. It wasn't very good fun for Dobbin, and indeed to be alone at Vauxhall I have found, from my own experience, to be one of the most dismal sports ever entered into by a bachelor. The 2 couples were perfectly happy then in their box, where the most delightful and intimate conversation took place. Jos was in his glory, ordering about the waiters with great majesty. He made the salad, and uncorked the champagne, and carved the chickens, and ate and drank the greater part of the refreshments on the tables. Finally, he insisted upon having a bowl of rack punch. Everybody had rack punch at Vauxhall. "Waiter, rack punch." That bowl of rack punch was the cause of all this history. And why not a bowl of rack punch as well as any other cause? Was not a bowl of prussic acid the cause of fair Rosamond's retiring from the world? Was not a bowl of wine the cause of the demise of Alexander the Great, or at least does not Dr. Lempriere say so? So did this bowl of rack punch influence the fates of all the principal characters in this novel without a hero, which we are now relating. It influenced their life, although most of them did not taste a drop of it. The young ladies did not drink it, Osborne did not like it, and the consequence was that Jos, that fat gourmand, drank up the whole contents of the bowl, and the consequence of his drinking up the whole contents of the bowl was a liveliness which at first was astonishing, and then became almost painful, for he talked and laughed so loud as to bring scores of listeners round the box, much to the confusion of the innocent party within it, and, volunteering to sing a song, which he did in that maudlin high key peculiar to gentlemen in an inebriated state, he almost drew away the audience who were gathered round the musicians in the gilt scallop shell, and received from his hearers a great deal of applause. "Bravo, fat 'un!" said one. "Encore, Daniel Lambert!" said another. "What a figure for the tight-rope!" exclaimed another wag, to the inexpressible alarm of the ladies, and the great anger of Mr. Osborne. "For heaven's sake, Jos, let us get up and go!" cried that gentleman, and the young women rose. "Stop, my dearest diddle-diddle darling!" shouted Jos, now as bold as a lion, and clasping Miss Rebecca round the waist. Rebecca started, but she could not get away her hand. The laughter outside redoubled. Jos continued to drink, to make love, and to sing, and, winking and waving his glass gracefully to his audience, challenged all or any to come in and take a share of his punch. Mr. Osborne was just on the point of knocking down a gentleman in top boots who proposed to take advantage of this invitation, and a commotion seemed to be inevitable, when by the greatest good luck a gentleman of the name of Dobbin, who had been walking about the gardens, stepped up to the box. "Be off, you fools!" said this gentleman, shouldering off a great number of the crowd, who vanished presently before his cocked hat and fierce appearance, and he entered the box in a most agitated state. "Good heavens, Dobbin, where have you been?" Osborne said, seizing the white cashmere shawl from his friend's arm, and huddling up Amelia in it. "Make yourself useful, and take charge of Jos here, whilst I take the ladies to the carriage." Jos was for rising to interfere, but a single push from Osborne's finger sent him puffing back into his seat again, and the lieutenant was enabled to remove the ladies in safety. Jos kissed his hand to them as they retreated, and hiccuped out, "Bless you, bless you!" Then, seizing Captain Dobbin's hand, and weeping in the most pitiful way, he confided to that gentleman the secret of his loves. He adored that girl who had just gone out. He had broken her heart, he knew he had, by his conduct. He would marry her the next morning at St. George's, Hanover Square. He'd knock up the Archbishop of Canterbury at Lambeth, he would, by Jove, and have him in readiness, and, acting on this hint, Captain Dobbin shrewdly induced him to leave the gardens and hasten to Lambeth Palace, and, when once out of the gates, easily conveyed Mr. Jos Sedley into a hackney coach, which deposited him safely at his lodgings. George Osborne conducted the girls home in safety, and when the door was closed upon them, and as he walked across Russell Square, laughed so as to astonish the watchman. Amelia looked very ruefully at her friend as they went upstairs, and kissed her, and went to bed without any more talking. "He must propose to-morrow," thought Rebecca. "He called me his soul's darling 4 times. He squeezed my hand in Amelia's presence. He must propose to-morrow." And so thought Amelia too. And I dare say she thought of the dress she was to wear as bridesmaid, and of the presents which she should make to her nice little sister-in-law, and of a subsequent ceremony in which she herself might play a principal part, etc., and etc., and etc., and etc. Oh, ignorant young creatures! How little do you know the effect of rack punch! What is the rack in the punch at night to the rack in the head of a morning? To this truth I can vouch as a man. There is no headache in the world like that caused by Vauxhall punch. Through the lapse of 20 years I can remember the consequence of 2 glasses, 2 wine-glasses, but 2 upon the honour of a gentleman, and Joseph Sedley, who had a liver complaint, had swallowed at least a quart of the abominable mixture. That next morning, which Rebecca thought was to dawn upon her fortune, found Sedley groaning in agonies which the pen refuses to describe. Soda-water was not invented yet. Small beer, will it be believed, was the only drink with which unhappy gentlemen soothed the fever of their previous night's potation. With this mild beverage before him, George Osborne found the ex-collector of Boggley Wollah groaning on the sofa at his lodgings. Dobbin was already in the room, good-naturedly tending his patient of the night before. The 2 officers, looking at the prostrate bacchanalian, and askance at each other, exchanged the most frightful sympathetic grins. Even Sedley's valet, the most solemn and correct of gentlemen, with the muteness and gravity of an undertaker, could hardly keep his countenance in order as he looked at his unfortunate master. "Mr. Sedley was uncommon wild last night, sir," he whispered in confidence to Osborne, as the latter mounted the stair. "He wanted to fight the hackney coachman, sir. The captain was obliged to bring him upstairs in his arms like a baby." A momentary smile flickered over Mr. Brush's features as he spoke. Instantly, however, they relapsed into their usual unfathomable calm, as he flung open the drawing-room door, and announced, "Mr. Osborne." "How are you, Sedley?" that young wag began, after surveying his victim. "No bones broke? There's a hackney coachman downstairs with a black eye and a tied-up head, vowing he'll have the law of you." "What do you mean, law?" Sedley faintly asked. "For thrashing him last night, didn't he, Dobbin? You hit out, sir, like Molyneux. The watchman says he never saw a fellow go down so straight. Ask Dobbin." "You did have a round with the coachman," Captain Dobbin said, "and showed plenty of fight, too." "And that fellow with the white coat at Vauxhall, how Jos drove at him! How the women screamed! By Jove, sir, it did my heart good to see you. I thought you civilians had no pluck. but I'll never get in your way when you're in your cups, Jos." "I believe I'm very terrible when I'm roused," ejaculated Jos from the sofa, and made a grimace so dreary and ludicrous that the captain's politeness could restrain him no longer, and he and Osborne fired off a ringing volley of laughter. Osborne pursued his advantage pitilessly. He thought Jos a milksop. He had been revolving in his mind the marriage question pending between Jos and Rebecca, and was not over well pleased that a member of the family into which he, George Osborne, of the th, was going to marry, should make a mesalliance with a little nobody, a little upstart governess. "You hit, you poor old fellow!" said Osborne. "You terrible! Why, man, you couldn't stand. You made everybody laugh in the gardens, though you were crying yourself. You were maudlin, Jos. Don't you remember singing a song?" "A what?" Jos asked. "A sentimental song, and calling Rosa, Rebecca, what's her name, Amelia's little friend, your dearest diddle diddle darling?" And this ruthless young fellow, seizing hold of Dobbin's hand, acted over the scene, to the horror of the original performer, and in spite of Dobbin's good-natured entreaties to him to have mercy. "Why should I spare him?" Osborne said to his friend's remonstrances when they quitted the invalid, leaving him under the hands of Dr. Gollop. "What the deuce right has he to give himself his patronising airs, and make fools of us at Vauxhall? Who's this little schoolgirl that is ogling and making love to him? Hang it, the family's low enough already without her. A governess is all very well, but I'd rather have a lady for my sister-in-law. I'm a liberal man, but I've proper pride, and know my own station. Let her know hers, and I'll take down that great hectoring nabob, and prevent him from being made a greater fool than he is. That's why I told him to look out, lest she brought an action against him." "I suppose you know best," Dobbin said, though rather dubiously. "You always were a Tory, and your family's one of the oldest in England, but—" "Come and see the girls, and make love to Miss Sharp yourself," the lieutenant here interrupted his friend. But Captain Dobbin declined to join Osborne in his daily visit to the young ladies in Russell Square. As George walked down Southampton Row from Holborn, he laughed as he saw, at the Sedley mansion, in 2 different stories, 2 heads on the lookout. The fact is, Miss Amelia, in the drawing-room balcony, was looking very eagerly towards the opposite side of the square, where Mr. Osborne dwelt, on the watch for the lieutenant himself; and Miss Sharp, from her little bedroom on the 2nd floor, was in observation until Mr. Joseph's great form should heave into sight. "Sister Anne is on the watch-tower," said he to Amelia, "but there's nobody coming." And laughing and enjoying the joke hugely, he described in the most ludicrous terms to Miss Sedley the dismal condition of her brother. "I think it's very cruel of you to laugh, George," she said, looking particularly unhappy. But George only laughed the more at her piteous and discomfited mind, persisted in thinking the joke a most diverting one, and when Miss Sharp came downstairs, bantered her with a great deal of liveliness upon the effect of her charms on the fat civilian. "Oh, Miss Sharp, if you could but see him this morning," he said, moaning in his flowered dressing-gown, writhing on his sofa, "if you could but have seen him lolling out his tongue to Gollop the apothecary." "See whom?" said Miss Sharp. "Whom? Oh, whom? Captain Dobbin, of course, to whom we were all so attentive, by the way, last night." "We were very unkind to him," Emmy said, blushing very much. I quite forgot him." "Of course you did," cried Osborne, still on the laugh. "One can't be always thinking about Dobbin, you know, Amelia. Can one, Miss Sharp?" "Except when he overset the glass of wine at dinner," Miss Sharp said, with a haughty air and a toss of the head, "I never gave the existence of Captain Dobbin one single moment's consideration." "Very good, Miss Sharp. I'll tell him," Osborne said, and as he spoke, Miss Sharp began to have a feeling of distrust and hatred towards this young officer, which she was quite unconscious of having inspired. "He is to make fun of me, is he?" thought Rebecca. "Has he been laughing about me to Joseph? Has he frightened him? Perhaps he won't come." A film passed over her eyes, and her heart beat quite quick. "You're always joking," said she, smiling as innocently as she could. "Joke away, Mr. George. There's nobody to defend me." and George Osborne, as she walked away, and Amelia looked reprovingly at him, felt some little manly compunction for having inflicted any unnecessary unkindness upon this helpless creature. "My dearest Amelia," said he, "you are too good, too kind. You don't know the world. I do. And your little friend Miss Sharp must learn her station." "Don't you think Jos will—" "Upon my word, my dear, I don't know. He may or may not. I'm not his master. I only know he is a very foolish, vain fellow, and put my dear little girl into a very painful and awkward position last night. My dearest diddle diddle darling!" He was off laughing again, and he did it so drolly that Emmy laughed too. All that day Jos never came. But Amelia had no fear about this, for the little schemer had actually sent away the page, Mr. Sambo's aide-de-camp, to Mr. Joseph's lodgings, to ask for some book he had promised, and how he was; and the reply through Joseph's man, Mr. Brush, was, that his master was ill in bed, and had just had the doctor with him. He must come to-morrow, she thought, but she never had the courage to speak a word on the subject to Rebecca, nor did that young woman herself allude to it in any way during the whole evening after the night at Vauxhall. The next day, however, as the two young ladies sat on the sofa, pretending to work, or to write letters, or to read novels, Sambo came into the room with his usual engaging grin, with a packet under his arm, and a note on a tray. "Note for Mr. Jos, miss," says Sambo. How Amelia trembled as she opened it. So it ran: "Dear Amelia, I send you The Orphan of the Forest. I was too ill to come yesterday. I leave town to-day for Cheltenham. Pray excuse me, if you can, to the amiable Miss Sharp for my conduct at Vauxhall, and entreat her to pardon and forget every word I may have uttered when excited by that fatal supper. As soon as I have recovered, for my health is very much shaken, I shall go to Scotland for some months, and am, truly yours, Jos Sedley." It was the death warrant. All was over. Amelia did not dare to look at Rebecca's pale face and burning eyes, but she dropped the letter into her friend's lap, and got up, and went upstairs to her room, and cried her little heart out. Blenkinsop, the housekeeper, there sought her presently with consolation, on whose shoulder Amelia wept confidentially, and relieved herself a good deal. "Don't take on, miss. I didn't like to tell you, but none of us in the house have liked her except at first. I saw her with my own eyes reading your ma's letters. Pinner says she's always about your trinket box and drawers, and everybody's drawers, and she's sure she's put your white ribbing into her box." I gave it her, Amelia said. But this did not alter Mrs. Blenkinsop's opinion of Miss Sharp. "I don't trust them governesses, Pinner," she remarked to the maid. "They give themselves the hairs and hupstarts of ladies, and their wages is no better than you nor me." It now became very clear to every soul in the house, except poor Amelia, that Rebecca should take her departure, and high and low, always with the one exception, agreed that that event should take place as speedily as possible. Our good child ransacked all her drawers, cupboards, reticules, and gimcrack boxes, passed in review all her gowns, fichus, tags, bobbins, laces, silk stockings, and fallals, selecting this thing and that and the other to make a little heap for Rebecca, and going to her papa, that generous British merchant, who had promised to give her as many guineas as she was years old, she begged the old gentleman to give the money to dear Rebecca, who must want it, while she lacked for nothing. She even made George Osborne contribute, and nothing loath, for he was as free-handed a young fellow as any in the army, he went to Bond Street and bought the best hat and spencer that money could buy. "That's George's present to you, Rebecca dear," said Amelia, quite proud of the bandbox conveying these gifts. "What a taste he has! There's nobody like him." "Nobody," Rebecca answered. "How thankful I am to him!" She was thinking in her heart, "It was George Osborne who prevented my marriage," and she loved George Osborne accordingly. She made her preparations for departure with great equanimity, and accepted all the kind little Amelia's presents, after just the proper degree of hesitation and reluctance. She vowed eternal gratitude to Mrs. Sedley, of course, but did not intrude herself upon that good lady too much, who was embarrassed, and evidently wishing to avoid her. She kissed Mr. Sedley's hand when he presented her with the purse, and asked permission to consider him for the future as her kind friend and protector. Her behaviour was so affecting that he was going to write her a cheque for £20 more, but he restrained his feelings. The carriage was in waiting to take him to dinner, so he tripped away with a "God bless you, my dear. Always come here when you come to town, you know. Drive to the Mansion House, James." Finally came the parting with Miss Amelia, over which picture I intend to throw a veil. But after a scene in which one person was in earnest and the other a perfect performer, after the tenderest caresses, the most pathetic tears, the smelling bottle, and some of the very best feelings of the heart had been called into requisition, Rebecca and Amelia parted, the former vowing to love her friend for ever and ever and ever. End of chapter 6.
Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stacey Ford Osborne. Vanity Fair by William Thackeray, Chapter 7, Crawley of Queen's Crawley. Among the most respected of the names beginning in C which the Court Guide contained in the year 18 was that of Crawley, Sir Pitt, Baronet, Great Gaunt Street, and Queen's Crawley, Hants. This honourable name had figured constantly also in the parliamentary list for many years, in conjunction with that of a number of other worthy gentlemen who sat in turns for the borough. It is related, with regard to the borough of Queen's Crawley, that Queen Elizabeth, in one of her progresses, stopping at Crawley to breakfast, was so delighted with some remarkably fine Hampshire beer which was then presented to her by the Crawley of the day, a handsome gentleman with a trim beard and a good leg, that she forthwith erected Crawley into a borough to send 2 members to Parliament, and the place, from the day of that illustrious visit, took the name of Queen's Crawley, which it holds up to the present moment. And though, by the lapse of time and those mutations which age produces in empires, cities, and boroughs, Queen's Crawley was no longer so populous a place as it had been in Queen Bess's time, nay, was come down to the condition of borough which used to be denominated rotten, yet, as Sir Pitt Crawley would say, with perfect justice in his elegant way, "Rotten! Be hanged! It produces me a good 1,500 a year." Sir Pitt Crawley, named after the great commoner, was the son of Walpole Crawley, first baronet of the tape and sealing wax office in the reign of George II, when he was impeached for peculation, as were a great number of other honest gentlemen of those days, and Walpole Crawley was, as need scarcely be said, son of John Churchill Crawley, named after the celebrated military commander of the reign of Queen Anne. The family tree, which hangs up at Queen's Crawley, furthermore mentions Charles Stuart, afterwards called Barebones Crawley, son of the Crawley of James I's time, and finally Queen Elizabeth's Crawley, who is represented as the foreground of the picture in his forked beard and armour. Out of his waistcoat, as usual, grows a tree, on the main branches of which the above illustrious names are inscribed. Close by the name of Sir Pitt Crawley, Baronet, the subject of the present memoir, are written that of his brother, the Reverend Bute Crawley. The great commoner was in disgrace when the reverend gentleman was born, rector of Crawley cum Snailby, and of various other male and female members of the Crawley family. Sir Pitt was first married to Grizzel, 6th daughter of Mungo Binkie, Lord Binkie, and cousin in consequence of Mr. Dundas. She brought him 2 sons, Pitt, named not so much after his father as after the heaven-born minister, and Rawdon Crawley, from the Prince of Wales' friend, whom his Majesty George IV forgot so completely. Many years after her ladyship's demise, Sir Pitt led to the altar Rosa, daughter of Mr. G. Dawson of Mudbury, by whom he had 2 daughters, for whose benefit Miss Rebecca Sharp was now engaged as governess. It will be seen that the young lady has come into a family of very genteel connections, and was about to move in a much more distinguished circle than that humble one which she had just quitted in Russell Square. She had received her orders to join her pupils in a note which was written upon an old envelope, and which contained the following words: Sir Pitt Crawley begs Miss Sharp and baggage may be here on Tuesday, as I leave for Queen's Crawley tomorrow morning early. Great Gaunt Street. Rebecca had never seen a baronet, as far as she knew, and as soon as she had taken leave of Amelia, and counted the guineas which good-natured Mr. Sedley had put into a purse for her, and as soon as she had done wiping her eyes with her handkerchief, which operation she concluded the very moment the carriage had turned the corner of the street, she began to depict in her own mind what a baronet must be. "I wonder, does he wear a star?" thought she, "or is it only lords that wear stars? But he will be very handsomely dressed in a court suit, with ruffles, and his hair a little powdered like Mr. Rotten at Covent Garden. I suppose he will be awfully proud, and that I shall be treated most contemptuously. Still I must bear my hard lot as well as I can. At least I shall be amongst gentlefolks, and not with vulgar city people." And she fell to thinking of her Russell Square friends with that very same philosophical bitterness with which, in a certain apologue, the fox is represented as speaking of the grapes. Having passed through Gaunt Square into Great Gaunt Street, the carriage at length stopped at a tall, gloomy house between two other tall, gloomy houses, each with a hatchment over the middle drawing-room window, as is the custom of houses in Great Gaunt Street, in which gloomy locality death seems to reign perpetual. The shutters of the first-floor windows of Sir Pitt's mansion were closed. Those of the dining-room were partially open, and the blinds neatly covered up in old newspapers. John, the groom, who had driven the carriage alone, did not care to descend to ring the bell, and so prayed a passing milk-boy to perform that office for him. When the bell was rung, a head appeared between the interstices of the dining-room shutters, and the door was opened by a man in drab breeches and gaiters, with a dirty old coat, a foul old neckcloth lashed around his bristly neck, a shining bald head, a leering red face, a pair of twinkling grey eyes, and a mouth perpetually on the grin. "This Sir Pitt Crawley's?" says John from the box. "Ees," says the man at the door with a nod. "Hand down these here trunks, then," said John. "Hand 'em down yourself," said the porter. "Don't you see I can't leave my horses? Come, bear a hand, me fine feller, and Miss will give you some beer," said John with a hoarse laugh, for he was no longer respectful of Miss Sharp, as her connection with the family was broken off, and as she had given nothing to the servants in coming away. The bald-headed man, taking his hands out of his breeches pockets, advanced on this summons, and throwing Miss Sharp's trunk over his shoulder, carried it into the house. "Take this basket and shawl, if you please, and open the door," said Miss Sharp, and descended from the carriage in much indignation. "I shall write to Mr. Sedley, and inform him of your conduct," said she to the groom. "Don't," replied the functionary. "I hope you've forgot nothing. Miss Melia's gowns, have you got them, as the lady's maid was to have had? I hope they'll fit you. Shut the door, Jim, you'll get no good out of her," continued John, pointing with his thumb towards Miss Sharp. "A bad lot, I'll tell you, a bad lot." And so saying, Mr. Sedley's groom drove away. The truth is, he was attached to the lady's maid in question, and indignant that she should have been robbed of her perquisites. On entering the dining-room, by the orders of the individual in gaiters, Rebecca found that apartment not more cheerful than such rooms usually are when genteel families are out of town. The faithful chambers seem, as it were, to mourn the absence of their masters. The Turkey carpet has rolled itself up, and retired sulkily under the sideboard. The pictures have hidden their faces behind old sheets of brown paper. The ceiling lamp is muffled up in a dismal sack of brown holland. The window curtains have disappeared under all sorts of shabby envelopes. The marble bust of Sir Walpole Crawley is looking from its black corner at the bare boards, and the oiled firearms, and the empty card-racks over the mantelpiece. The cellaret has lurked behind the carpet, the chairs are turned up heads and tails along the walls, and in the dark corner opposite the statue is an old-fashioned crabbed knife-box, locked, and sitting on a dumbwaiter. 2 kitchen chairs and a round table, and an attenuated old poker and tongs were, however, gathered round the fireplace, as was a saucepan over a feeble sputtering fire. There was a bit of cheese and bread, and a tin candlestick on the table, and a little black porter in a pint pot. "Had your supper, I suppose? It is not too warm for you? Like a drop of beer?" "Where is Sir Pitt Crawley?" asked Miss Sharp majestically. I'm Sir Pitt Crawley. Recollect you owe me a pint for bringing down your luggage. Ask Tinker if I ain't. Mrs. Tinker, Miss Sharp. Miss Governess, Mrs. Charwoman. Ho! The lady addressed as Mrs. Tinker at this moment made her appearance with a pipe and a paper of tobacco, for which she had been dispatched a minute before Miss Sharp's arrival, and she handed the articles over to Sir Pitt, who had taken his seat by the fire. "Where's the farden?" said he. "I gave you 3 halfpence. Where's the change, old Tinker?" "There," replied Mrs. Tinker, flinging down the coin. "It's only baronets as cares about farthings." "A farthing a day is 7 shillings a year," answered M.P. 7 shillings a year is the interest of 7 guineas. Take care of your farthings, old Tinker, and your guineas will come quite natural. "You may be sure it's Sir Pitt Crawley, young woman," said Mrs. Tinker surlily, "because he looks to his farthings. You'll know him better afore long." "And like me none the worse, Miss Sharp," said the old gentleman with an air of almost politeness. "I must be just before I'm generous." "He never gave away a farthing in his life," growled Tinker. "Never and never will. It's against my principle. Go and get another chair from the kitchen, Tinker, if you want to sit down, and then we'll have a bit of supper." Presently the baronet plunged a fork into the saucepan on the fire, and withdrew from the pot a piece of tripe and an onion, which he divided into pretty equal portions, and of which he partook with Mrs. Tinker. "You see, Miss Sharp, when I'm not here, Tinker's on board wages. When I'm in town, she dines with the family. Ha, ha, ha! I'm glad Miss Sharp's not hungry, ain't you, Tink?" And they fell to upon their frugal supper. After supper, Sir Pitt Crawley began to smoke his pipe, and when it became quite dark, he lighted the rushlight in the tin candlestick, and producing from an interminable pocket a huge mass of papers, began reading them and putting them in order. "I'm here on law business, my dear, and that's how it happens that I shall have the pleasure of such a pretty travelling companion to-morrow." "He's always at law business," said Mrs. Tinker, taking up the pot of porter. "Drink and drink about," said the baronet. "Yes, my dear, Tinker is quite right. I've lost and won more lawsuits than any man in England. Look here at Crawley, Bart versus Snaffle. I'll throw him over, or my name's not Pitt Crawley. Potter and another versus Crawley, Bart. Overseer of Snaily Parish against Crawley, Bart. They can't prove it's common. I'll defy 'em. The land's mine. It no longer belongs to the parish than it does to you or Tinker here. I'll beat 'em if it costs me 1,000 guineas. Look over the papers. You may, if you like, my dear. Do you write a good hand? I'll make you useful when we're at Queen's Crawley, depend on it, Miss Sharp. Now the dowager's dead, I want someone." "She was as bad as he," said Tinker. "She took the law and every one of her tradesmen, and turned away 48 footmen in 4 year." "She was close, very close," said the baronet simply. "But she was a valuable woman to me, and saved me a steward." And in this confidential strain, and much to the amusement of the newcomer, the conversation continued for a considerable time. Whatever Sir Pitt Crawley's qualities may be, good or bad, he did not make the least disguise of them. He talked of himself incessantly, sometimes in the coarsest and vulgarest Hampshire accent, sometimes adopting the tone of a man of the world. And so, with the injunctions to Miss Sharp to be ready at 5 in the morning, he bade her good night. "You'll sleep with Tinker to-night," he said. "It's a big bed, and there's room for 2. Lady Crawley died in it. Good night." Sir Pitt went off after this benediction, and the solemn Tinker, rushlight in hand, led the way up the great bleak stone stairs, past the great dreary drawing-room doors with the handles muffled up in paper, into the great front bedroom, where Lady Crawley had slept her last. The bed and chamber were so funereal and gloomy, you might have fancied not only that Lady Crawley died in the room, but that her ghost inhabited it. Rebecca sprang about the apartment, however, with the greatest liveliness, and had peeped into the huge wardrobes and the closets and the cupboards, and tried the drawers, which were locked, and examined the dreary pictures and toilette appointments, while the old charwoman was saying her prayers. "I shouldn't like to sleep in this here bed without a good conscience, miss," said the old woman. "There's room for us and a half-dozen of ghosts in it," said Rebecca. "Tell me all about Lady Crawley and Sir Pitt Crawley and everybody, my dear Mrs. Tinker." But old Tinker was not to be pumped up by this little cross-questioner, and signifying to her that bed was a place for sleeping, not conversation, set up in her corner of the bed such a snore as only the nose of innocence can produce. Rebecca lay awake for a long, long time, thinking of the morrow, and of the new world into which she was going, and of her chances of success there. The rushlight flickered in the basin. The mantelpiece cast up a great black shadow over half of a mouldy old sampler, which her defunct ladyship had worked, no doubt, and over 2 little family pictures of young lads, one in a college gown and the other in a red jacket like a soldier. When she went to sleep, Rebecca chose that one to dream about. At 4 o'clock, on such a roseate summer's morning as even made the great Gaunt Street look cheerful, the faithful Tinker, having wakened her bedfellow and bid her prepare for departure, unbarred and unbolted the great hall door, the clanging and clapping whereof startled the sleeping echoes in the street, and taking her way into Oxford Street, summoned a coach from a stand there. It is needless to particularize the number of the vehicle, or to state that the driver was stationed thus early in the neighbourhood of Swallow Street, in hopes that some young buck, reeling homeward from the tavern, might need the aid of his vehicle, and pay him with the generosity of intoxication. It is likewise needless to say that the driver, if he had any such hopes as those above stated, was grossly disappointed, and that the worthy baronet whom he drove to the city did not give him 1 single penny more than his fare. It was in vain that Jehu appealed and stormed, that he flung down Miss Sharp's bandboxes in the gutter at the Necks, and swore he would take the law of his fare. "You better not," said one of the ostlers. "Sir Pitt Crawley." "So it is, Joe," cried the baronet approvingly, "and I'd like to see the old man can do me." "So should I," said Joe, grinning sulkily and mounting the baronet's baggage on the roof of the coach. "Keep the box for me, leader," exclaims the Member of Parliament to the coachman, who replies, "Yes, Sir Pitt," with a touch of his hat and rage in his soul, for he had promised the box to a young gentleman from Cambridge who would have given a crown to a certainty. And Miss Sharp was accommodated with a back seat inside the carriage, which might be said to be carrying her into the wide world. How the young man from Cambridge sulkily put his 5 greatcoats in front, but was reconciled when little Miss Sharp was made to quit the carriage and mount up beside him, when he covered her up in one of his Benjamins and became perfectly good-humoured. How the asthmatic gentleman, the prim lady who declared upon her sacred honour she had never travelled in a public carriage before, there is always such a lady in a coach, alas, was, for the coaches, where are they? And the fat widow with the brandy bottle took their places inside. How the porter asked them all for money, and got 6 from the gentleman, and 5 greasy halfpence from the fat widow, and how the carriage at length drove away, now threading the dark lanes of Aldersgate, anon clattering by the blue cupola of St. Paul's, jingling rapidly by the Stranger's Entry of Fleet Market, which, with Exeter Change, has now departed to the world of shadows. How they passed the White Bear in Piccadilly, and saw the dew rising up from the market gardens of Knightsbridge. How Turnham Green, Brentwood, Bagshot were passed, need not be told here. But the writer of these pages, who was pursued in former days, and in the same bright weather, the same remarkable journey, cannot but think of it with a sweet and tender regret. Where is the road now, and its merry incidents of life? Is there no Chelsea or Greenwich for the old honest pimple-nosed coachman? I wonder where are they, those good fellows? Is old Weller alive or dead? And the waiters, yea, and the inns at which they waited, and the cold rounds of beef inside, and the stunted ostler with his blue nose and clinking pail, where is he? And where is his generation? To those great geniuses now in petticoats, who shall write novels for the beloved reader's children, these men and things will be as much legend and history as Nineveh, or Coeur de Lion, or Jack Sheppard. For them, stage-coaches will have become romances, a team of 4 bays as fabulous as Bucephalus or Black Bess. Ah, how their coats shone as the stablemen pulled their clothes off, and away they went. Ah, how their tails shook, as with smoking sides at the stage's end they demurely walked away into the inn-yard. Alas, we shall never hear the horns sing at midnight, or see the pike gates fly open any more. Whither, however, is the light four-inside Trafalgar coach carrying us? Let us be set down at Queen's Crawley without further divagation, and see how Miss Rebecca Sharp speeds there. End of Chapter 7.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 8. Private and Confidential. Miss Rebecca Sharp to Miss Amelia Sedley, Russell Square, London. Free Pitt Crawley. My dearest, sweetest Amelia, with what mingled joy and sorrow do I take up the pen to write to my dearest friend. Oh, what a change between today and yesterday! Now I am friendless and alone. Yesterday I was at home in the sweet company of a sister whom I shall ever, ever cherish. I will not tell you in what tears and sadness I passed the fatal night in which I separated from you. You went on Tuesday to joy and happiness with your mother and your devoted young soldier by your side. And I thought of you all night, dancing at the Perkinses, the prettiest, I am sure, of all the young ladies at the ball. I was brought by the groom in the old carriage to Sir Pitt Crawley's town house, where, after John the groom had behaved most rudely and insolently to me, alas, 'twas safe to insult poverty and misfortune, I was given over to Sir P.'s care, and made to pass the night in an old gloomy bed, and by the side of a horrid gloomy old charwoman who keeps the house. I did not sleep one single wink the whole night. Sir Pitt is not what we silly girls, when we used to read Cecilia at Chiswick, imagined a baronet must have been. Anything indeed less like Lord Orville cannot be imagined. Fancy an old, stumpy, short, vulgar, and very dirty man in old clothes and shabby old gaiters, who smokes a horrid pipe, and cooks his own horrid supper in a saucepan. He speaks with a country accent, and swore a great deal at the old charwoman, at the hackney coachman who drove us to the inn where the coach went from, and on which I made the journey outside for the greater part of the way. I was awakened at daybreak by the charwoman, and having arrived at the inn, was at first placed inside the coach, but when we got to a place called Leakington, where the rain began to fall very heavily, will you believe it, I was forced to come outside, for Sir Pitt is a proprietor of the coach, and as a passenger came at Mudbury who wanted an inside place, I was obliged to go outside in the rain, where, however, a young gentleman from Cambridge College sheltered me very kindly in one of his several greatcoats. This gentleman and the guard seemed to know Sir Pitt very well, and laughed at him a great deal. They both agreed in calling him an old screw, which means a very stingy, avaricious person. He never gives any money to anybody, they said, and this meanness I hate. And the young gentleman made me remark that we drove very slow for the last 2 stages on the road, because Sir Pitt was on the box, and because he is proprietor of the horses for this part of the journey. "But won't I flog 'em on to Squashmore when I take the ribbons?" said the young Cantab. "And sarve 'em right, Master Jack," said the guard. When I comprehended the meaning of this phrase, and that Master Jack intended to drive the rest of the way and revenge himself on Sir Pitt's horses, of course I laughed too. A carriage and 4 splendid horses, covered with armorial bearings, however, awaited us at Mudbury, 4 miles from Queen's Crawley, and we made our entrance to the baronet's park in state. There is a fine avenue of 1 mile long leading to the house, and the woman at the lodge gate, over the pillars of which are a serpent and a dove, the supporters of the Crawley arms, made us a number of curtsies as she flung open the old iron carved doors, which are something like those at odious Chiswick. "There's an avenue," said Sir Pitt, "1 mile long. There's 6,000 pound of timber in them there trees. Do you call that nothink?" He pronounced avenue, avenue, and nothing, nothink. So droll. And he had a Mr. Hodson, his hind from Mudbury, into the carriage with him, and they talked about distraining and selling up, and draining and subsoiling, and a great deal about tenants and farming, much more than I could understand. Sam Miles had been caught poaching, and Peter Bailey had gone to the workhouse at last. "Serve him right," said Sir Pitt. "Him and his family's been cheating me on that farm these 150 years. Some old tenant, I suppose, who could not pay his rent. Sir Pitt might have said he and his family, to be sure. But rich baronets do not need to be careful about grammar, as poor governesses must be. As we passed, I remarked a beautiful church spire rising above some old elms in the park, and before them, in the midst of a lawn and some outhouses, an old red house with tall chimneys covered with ivy, and the windows shining in the sun. "Is that your church, sir?" I said. "Yes, hang it," said Sir Pitt, only he used, dear, a much wickeder word. "How's Beauty, Hodson?" "Beauty's my brother Bute, my dear, my brother the parson. Ha ha! Beauty and the Beast, I call him. Ha ha ha!" Hodson laughed too, and then, looking more grave, and nodding his head, said, "I'm afraid he's better, Sir Pitt. He was out on his pony yesterday, looking at our corn." "Looking after his tithes, hangin'." Only he used the same wicked word. "Will brandy and water never kill him? He's as tough as old what-you-call-him, old Methusalem." Mr. Hodson laughed again. "The young men is home from college. They've whopped John Scroggins till he's well nigh dead." "What, my second keeper?" roared out Sir Pitt. "He was on the parson's ground, sir," replied Mr. Hodson. And Sir Pitt in a fury swore that if ever he caught 'em poaching on his ground, he'd transport 'em, by the Lord he would. However, he said, "I've sold the presentation of the living, Hodson. None of that breed shall get it, I warrant." And Mr. Hodson said he was quite right. And I have no doubt from this that the 2 brothers are at variance, as brothers often are, and sisters too. Don't you remember the 2 Miss Scratchleys at Chiswick, how they always used to fight and quarrel? And Mary Box, how she was always thumping Louisa? Presently, seeing 2 little boys gathering sticks in the wood, Mr. Hodson jumped out of the carriage at Sir Pitt's order, and rushed upon them with his whip. "Pitch into 'em, Hodson," roared the baronet. "Flog their little souls out and bring 'em up to the house, the vagabonds. I'll commit 'em, as sure as my name's Pitt." And presently we heard Mr. Hodson's whip cracking on the shoulders of the poor little blubbering wretches, and Sir Pitt, seeing that the malefactors were in custody, drove on to the hall. All the servants were ready to meet us, and here, my dear, I was interrupted last night by a dreadful thumping at my door, and who do you think it was? Sir Pitt Crawley, in his nightcap and dressing-gown. Such a figure! As I shrank away from such a visitor, he came forward and seized my candle. "No candles after 11 o'clock, Miss Becky," said he. "Go to bed in the dark, you pretty little hussy." That is what he called me. "And unless you wish me to come for the candle every night, mind and be in bed at 11. And with this, he and Mr. Horrocks the butler went off laughing. You may be sure I shall not encourage any more of their visits. They let loose 2 immense bloodhounds at night, which all last night were yelling and howling at the moon. "I call the dog Gora," said Sir Pitt. "He's killed a man, that dog has, and is master of a bull. And the mother I used to call Flora, but now I calls her Aurora, for she's too old to bite. Ho, ho, ho." Before the house of Queen's Crawley, which is an odious, old-fashioned, red-brick mansion with tall chimneys and gables of the style of Queen Bess, there is a terrace flanked by the family dove and serpent, and on which the great hall door opens. And oh, my dear, the great hall, I am sure, is as big and as glum as the great hall in the dear castle of Udolpho. It has a large fireplace in which we might put half Miss Pinkerton's school, and the grate is big enough to roast an ox at the very least. Round the room hang I don't know how many generations of Crawleys, some with beards and ruffs, some with huge wigs and toes turned out, some dressed in long straight stays and gowns that look as stiff as towers, and some with long ringlets and, oh my dear, scarcely any stays at all. At one end of the hall is the great staircase, all in black oak, as dismal as may be, and on either side are tall doors with stags' heads over them, leading to the billiard-room and the library and the great yellow saloon and the morning-rooms. I think there are at least 20 bedrooms on the first floor, and one of them has the bed in which Queen Elizabeth slept. And I've been taken by my new pupils through all these fine apartments this morning. They are not rendered less gloomy, I promise you, by having the shutters always shut. And there is scarce one of the apartments, but when the light was let into it, I expected to see a ghost in the room. We have a schoolroom on the second floor, with my bedroom leading into it on one side, and that of the young ladies on the other. Then there are Mr. Pitt's apartments, Mr. Crawley, he is called, the eldest son, and Mr. Rawdon Crawley's rooms. He is an officer, like somebody, and away with his regiment. There is no want of room, I assure you. You might lodge all the people in Russell Square in the house, I think, and have space to spare. Half an hour after our arrival, the great dinner bell was rung, and I came down with my 2 pupils. They are very thin, insignificant little chits of 10 and 8 years old. I came down in your dear muslin gown, about which that odious Mrs. Pinner was so rude because you gave it me, for I am to be treated as one of the family, except on company days, when the young ladies and I are to dine upstairs. Well, the great dinner bell rang, and we all assembled in the little drawing-room, where my Lady Crawley sits. She is the second Lady Crawley, and mother of the young ladies. She was an ironmonger's daughter, and her marriage was thought a great match. She looks as if she had been handsome once, and her eyes are always weeping for the loss of her beauty. She is pale and meagre and high-shouldered, and has not a word to say for herself, evidently. Her stepson, Mr. Crawley, was likewise in the room. He was in full dress, as pompous as an undertaker. He is pale, thin, ugly, silent. He has thin legs, no chest, hay-coloured whiskers, and straw-coloured hair. He is the very picture of his sainted mother over the mantelpiece, Griselda of the noble house of Binkie. "This is the new governess, Mr. Crawley," said Lady Crawley, coming forward and taking my hand. "Miss Sharp." "Oh," said Mr. Crawley, and pushed his head once forward and began again to read a great pamphlet with which he was busy. I hope you will be kind to my girls," said Lady Crawley, with her pink eyes always full of tears. "Law, ma, of course she will," said the eldest, and I saw at a glance that I need not be afraid of that woman. "My lady is served," says the butler, in black, in an immense white shirt frill that looked as if it had been one of the Queen Elizabeth's ruffs depicted in the hall, and so, taking Mr. Crawley's arm, she led the way to the dining-room, whither I followed, with my little pupils in each hand. Sir Pitt was already in the room with a silver jug. He had just been to the cellar, and was in full dress too. That is, he had taken his gaiters off, and showed his little dumpy legs in black worsted stockings. The sideboard was covered with glistening old plate, old cups, both gold and silver, old salvers and cruet stands, like Rundle and Bridge's shop. Everything on the table was in silver too, and 2 footmen with red hair and canary-coloured liveries stood on either side of the sideboard. Mr. Crawley said a long grace, and Sir Pitt said Amen, and the great silver dish-covers were removed. "What have we for dinner, Betsy?" said the baronet. "Mutton broth, I believe, Sir Pitt," answered Lady Crawley. "Mouton au navet," added the butler gravely. "Pronounced, if you please, mouton navet. And the soup is potage de mouton à l'Écossaise. The side dishes contain pommes de terre au naturel and chou-fleur à l'eau." "Mutton's mutton," said the baronet, "and a devilish good thing. What sheep is it, Horrocks, and when did you kill?" "One of the black-faced Scotch, Sir Pitt. We killed on Thursday." "Who took any?" "Steele of Mudbury took the saddle and 2 legs, Sir Pitt. But he says the last was too young and confounded woolly, Sir Pitt." "Will you take some potage, Miss Blunt?" said Mr. Crawley. "Capital Scotch broth, my dear," said Sir Pitt, "though they call it by a French name." "I believe it is the custom, sir, in decent society," said Mr. Crawley, haughtily, "to call the dish as I have called it." And it was served to us on silver soup plates by the footmen in the canary coats, with the mouton au navet. Then ale and water were brought and served to us young ladies in wine-glasses. I am not a judge of ale, but I can say, with a clear conscience, I prefer water. While we were enjoying our repast, Sir Pitt took occasion to ask what had become of the shoulders of the mutton. "I believe they were eaten in the servants' hall," said my lady humbly. "They was, my lady," said Horrocks, "and precious little else we get there neither." Sir Pitt burst into a horse laugh and continued his conversation with Mr. Horrocks. "That there little black pig of the Kent sows breed must be uncommon fat now." "It's not quite bustin', Sir Pitt," said the butler with the gravest air, at which Sir Pitt, and with him the young ladies this time, began to laugh violently. "Miss Crawley, Miss Rose Crawley," said Mr. Crawley, "your laughter strikes me as being exceedingly out of place." "Never mind, my lord," said the baronet. "We'll try the porker on Saturday. Kill him on Saturday morning, John Horrocks. Miss Sharp adores pork, don't you, Miss Sharp?"
And I think that is all the conversation that I remember at dinner. When the repast was concluded, a jug of hot water was placed before Sir Pitt, with a case bottle containing, I believe, rum. Mr. Horrocks served myself and my pupils with 3 little glasses of wine, and a bumper was poured out for my lady. When we retired, she took from her work-drawer an enormous, interminable piece of knitting. The young ladies began to play at cribbage with a dirty pack of cards. We had but one candle lighted, but it was in a magnificent old silver candlestick, and after a very, very few questions from my lady, I had my choice of amusement between a volume of sermons and a pamphlet on the Corn Laws, which Mr. Crawley had been reading before dinner. So we sat for an hour, until steps were heard. "Oh, put away the cards, girls!" cried my lady in a great tremor. "Put down Mr. Crawley's books, Miss Sharp." And these orders had been scarcely obeyed when Mr. Crawley entered the room. "We will resume yesterday's discourse, young ladies," said he, "and you shall each read a page by turns, so that Miss Short may have an opportunity of hearing you." And the poor girls began to spell a long dismal sermon delivered at Bethesda Chapel, Liverpool, on behalf of the Mission for the Chickasaw Indians. Was it not a charming evening? At 10 the servants were told to call Sir Pitt and the household to prayers. Sir Pitt came in first, very much flushed and rather unsteady in his gait, and after him the butler, the canaries, Mr. Crawley's man, 3 other men smelling very much of the stable, and 4 women, one of whom, I remarked, was very much overdressed, and who flung me a look of great scorn as she plumped down on her knees. After Mr. Crawley had done haranguing and expounding, we received our candles, and then we went to bed, and then I was disturbed in my writing, as I have described, to my dearest, sweetest Amelia. Good night. 1,000,000,000 kisses. Saturday. This morning at 5 I heard the shrieking of the little black pig. Rose and Violet introduced me to it yesterday, and to the stables, and to the kennel, and to the gardener, who was picking fruit to send to market, and from whom they begged hard a bunch of hothouse grapes, but he said that Sir Pitt had numbered every man-jack of them, and it would be as much as his place was worth to give any away. The darling girls caught a colt in a paddock and asked me if I would ride, and began to ride themselves, when the groom, coming with horrid oaths, drove them away. Lady Crawley is always knitting the worsted, Sir Pitt is always tipsy every night, and, I believe, sits with Horrocks the butler. Mr. Crawley always reads sermons in the evening, and in the morning is locked up in his study, or else rides to Mudbury on county business, or to Squashmore, where he preaches on Wednesdays and Fridays to the tenants there. 100,000 grateful loves to your dear papa and mamma. Is your poor brother recovered of his rack punch? Oh dear, how men should beware of wicked punch. Ever and ever thine own, Rebecca. Everything considered, I think
it is quite as well for our dear Amelia Sedley in Russell Square that Miss Sharp and she are parted. Rebecca is a droll, funny creature, to be sure, and those descriptions of the poor lady weeping for the loss of her beauty, and the gentleman with hay-coloured whiskers and straw-coloured hair, are very smart, doubtless, and show a great knowledge of the world. That she might, when on her knees, have been thinking of something better than Miss Horrocks' ribbons, has possibly struck both of us. But my kind reader will please to remember that this history has Vanity Fair for a title, and that Vanity Fair is a very vain, wicked, foolish place, full of all sorts of humbugs and falsenesses and pretensions. And while the moralist who is holding forth on the cover an accurate portrait of your humble servant professes to wear neither gown nor bands, but only the very same long-eared livery in which his congregation is arrayed, yet, look you, one is bound to speak the truth as far as one knows it, whether one mounts a cap and bells or a shovel hat. And a deal of disagreeable matter must come out in the course of such an undertaking. I have heard a brother of the story-telling trade at Naples preaching to a pack of good-for-nothing, honest, lazy fellows by the seashore, work himself up into such a rage and passion with some of the villains whose wicked deeds he was describing and inventing, that the audience could not resist it, and they and the poet together would burst out into a roar of oaths and execrations against the fictitious monster of the tale, so that the hat went round and the baiocchi tumbled into it, in the midst of a perfect storm of sympathy. At the little Paris theatres, on the other hand, you will not only hear the people yelling out, "Un gredin! Un monstre!" and cursing the tyrant of the play from the boxes, but the actors themselves positively refuse to play the wicked parts, such as those of infâmes Anglais, brutal Cossacks, and what not, and prefer to appear at a smaller salary in their real characters as loyal Frenchmen. I set the two stories one against the other so that you may see that it is not from mere mercenary motives that the present performer is desirous to show up and trounce his villains, but because he has a sincere hatred of them which he cannot keep down, and which must find a vent in suitable abuse and bad language. I warn my kind friends, then, that I am going to tell a story of harrowing villainy and complicated, but as I trust intensely interesting, crime. My rascals are no milk and water rascals, I promise you. When we come to the proper places, we won't spare fine language, no. But when we are going over the quiet country, we must perforce be calm. A tempest in a slop basin is absurd. We will reserve that sort of thing for the mighty ocean and the lonely midnight. The present chapter is very mild. Others, but we will not anticipate those. And as we bring our characters forward, I will ask leave, as a man and a brother, not only to introduce them, but occasionally to step down from the platform and talk about them. If they are good and kindly, to love them and shake them by the hand. If they are silly, to laugh at them confidentially in the reader's sleeve. If they are wicked and heartless, to abuse them in the strongest terms which politeness admits of. Otherwise you might fancy it was I who was sneering at the practice of devotion which Miss Sharp finds so ridiculous, that it was I who laughed good-humouredly at the reeling old Silenus of a baronet, whereas the laughter comes from one who has no reverence except for prosperity, and no eye for anything beyond success. Such people there are, living and flourishing in the world, faithless, hopeless, charityless. Let us have at them, dear friends, with might and main. Some there are, and very successful too, mere quacks and fools, and it was to combat and expose such as those, no doubt, that laughter was made. End of chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 9. Family Portraits. Sir Pitt Crawley was a philosopher with a taste for what is called low life. His first marriage with the daughter of the noble Binkie had been made under the auspices of his parents, and as he often told Lady Crawley in her lifetime, she was such a confounded, quarrelsome, high-bred jay that when she died he was hanged if he would ever take another of her sort. At her ladyship's demise he kept his promise, and selected for a second wife Miss Rose Dawson, daughter of Mr. John Thomas Dawson, ironmonger of Mudbury. What a happy woman was Rose to be my Lady Crawley! Let us set down the items of her happiness. In the first place, she gave up Peter Butt, a young man who kept company with her, and in consequence of his disappointment in love took to smuggling, poaching, and 1,000 other bad courses. Then she quarrelled, as in duty bound, with all the friends and intimates of her youth, who of course could not be received by my lady at Queen's Crawley. Nor did she find in her new rank and abode any persons who were willing to welcome her. Whoever did? Sir Huddleston Fuddleston had 3 daughters, who all hoped to be Lady Crawley. Sir Giles Wapshot's family were insulted that one of the Wapshot girls had not the preference in the marriage, and the remaining baronets of the county were indignant at their comrades' misalliance. Never mind the commoners, whom we will leave to grumble anonymously. Sir Pitt did not care, as he said, a brass farden for any one of them. He had his pretty Rose, and what more need a man require than to please himself? So he used to get drunk every night, to beat his pretty Rose sometimes, to leave her in Hampshire when he went to London for the parliamentary session without a single friend in the wide world. Even Mrs. Bute Crawley, the rector's wife, refused to visit her, as she said she would never give the pas to a tradesman's daughter. As the only endowments with which nature had gifted Lady Crawley were those of pink cheeks and a white skin, and as she had no sort of character, nor talents, nor opinions, nor occupations, nor amusements, nor that vigor of soul and ferocity of temper which often falls to the lot of entirely foolish women, her hold upon Sir Pitt's affections was not very great. Her roses faded out of her cheeks, and the pretty freshness left her figure after the birth of a couple of children, and she became a mere machine in her husband's house, of no more use than the late Lady Crawley's grand piano. Being a light-complexioned woman, she wore light clothes, as most blondes will, and appeared in preference in draggled sea-green or slatternly sky-blue. She worked that worsted day and night, or other pieces like it. she had counterpanes in the course of a few years to all the beds in Crawley. She had a small flower garden, for which she had rather an affection, but beyond this no other like or disliking. When her husband was rude to her, she was apathetic. Whenever he struck her, she cried. She had not character enough to take to drinking, and moaned about, slipshod and in curl-papers, all day. Oh, Vanity Fair, Vanity Fair! This might have been, but for you, a cheery lass, Peter Butt and Rose, a happy man and wife, in a snug farm with a hearty family, and an honest portion of pleasures, cares, hopes, and struggles. But a title and a coach and four are toys more precious than happiness in Vanity Fair. And if Harry the Eighth or Bluebeard were alive now and wanted a 10th wife, do you suppose he could not get the prettiest girl that shall be presented this season? The languid dullness of their mamma did not, as it may be supposed, awaken much affection in her little daughters. But they were very happy in the servants' hall and in the stables, and the Scotch gardener having luckily a good wife and some good children, they got a little wholesome society and instruction in his lodge, which was the only education bestowed upon them until Miss Sharp came. Her engagement was owing to the remonstrances of Mr. Pitt Crawley, the only friend or protector Lady Crawley ever had, and the only person, besides her children, for whom she entertained a little feeble attachment. Mr. Pitt took after the noble Binkies, from whom he was descended, and was a very polite and proper gentleman. When he grew to man's estate and came back from Christchurch, he began to reform the slackened discipline of the hall, in spite of his father, who stood in awe of him. He was a man of such rigid refinement that he would have starved rather than have dined without a white neckcloth. Once, when just from college, and when Horrocks the butler brought him a letter without placing it previously on a tray, he gave that domestic a look, and administered to him a speech so cutting that Horrocks ever after trembled before him. The whole household bowed to him. Lady Crawley's curl-papers came off earlier when he was at home. Sir Pitt's muddy gaiters disappeared, and if that incorrigible old man still adhered to other old habits, he never fuddled himself with rum and water in his son's presence, and only talked to his servants in a very reserved and polite manner, and those persons remarked that Sir Pitt never swore at Lady Crawley while his own son was in the room. It was he who taught the butler to say, "My lady is served," and who insisted on handing her ladyship in to dinner. He seldom spoke to her, but when he did, it was with the most powerful respect, and he never let her quit the apartment without rising in the most stately manner to open the door, and making an elegant bow at her egress. At Eton he was called Miss Crawley, and there, I'm sorry to say, his younger brother, Rawdon, used to lick him violently. But though his parts were not brilliant, he made up for his lack of talent by meritorious industry, and was never known, during 8 years at school, to be subject to that punishment which it is generally thought none but a cherub can escape. At college his career was, of course, highly creditable, and here he prepared himself for public life, into which he was to be introduced by the patronage of his grandfather, Lord Binkie, by studying the ancient and modern orators with great assiduity, and by speaking unceasingly at the debating societies. But though he had a fine flux of words, and delivered his little voice with great pomposity and pleasure to himself, and never advanced any sentiment or opinion which was not perfectly trite and stale, and supported by a Latin quotation, yet he failed somehow, in spite of a mediocrity which ought to have ensured any man a success. He did not even get the prize poem, which all his friends said he was sure of. After leaving college he became private secretary to Lord Binkie, and was then appointed attaché to the legation at Pumpernickel, which post he filled with perfect honour, and brought home dispatches, consisting of Strasbourg pie, to the foreign minister of the day. After remaining 10 years attaché, several years after the lamented Lord Binkie's demise, and finding the advancement slow, he at length gave up the diplomatic service in some disgust, and began to turn country gentleman. He wrote a pamphlet on malt on returning to England, for he was an ambitious man and always liked to be before the public, and took a strong part in the Negro emancipation question. Then he became a friend of Mr. Wilberforce's, whose politics he admired, and had that famous correspondence with the Reverend Silas Hornblower on the Ashanti mission. He was in London, if not for the Parliament session, at least in May, for the religious meetings. In the country he was a magistrate, and an active visitor and speaker among those destitute of religious instruction. He was said to be paying his addresses to Lady Jane Sheepshanks, Lord Southdown's third daughter, and whose sister, Lady Emily, wrote those sweet tracts, The Sailor's True Binnacle, and The Apple Woman of Finchley Common. Miss Sharp's accounts of his employment at Queen's Crawley were not caricatures. He subjected the servants there to the devotional exercises before mentioned, in which, and so much the better, he brought his father to join. He patronized an independent meeting-house in Crawley parish, much to the indignation of his uncle, the rector, and to the consequent delight of Sir Pitt, who was induced to go himself once or twice, which occasioned some violent sermons at Crawley parish church, directed point-blank at the baronet's old Gothic pew there. Honest Sir Pitt, however, did not feel the force of these discourses, as he always took his nap during sermon time. Mr. Crawley was very earnest for the good of the nation and of the Christian world, that the old gentleman should yield him up his place in Parliament, but this the elder constantly refused to do. Both were, of course, too prudent to give up the 1,500 a year which was brought in by the second seat, at this period filled by Mr. Quadroon with carte blanche on the slave question. Indeed, the family estate was much embarrassed, and the income drawn from the borough was of great use to the house of Queen's Crawley. It had never recovered the heavy fine imposed upon Walpole Crawley, 1st Baronet, for peculation in the tape and sealing wax office. Sir Walpole was a jolly fellow, eager to seize and to spend money, alieni appetens sui profusus, as Mr. Crawley would remark with a sigh, and in his day beloved by all the county for the constant drunkenness and hospitality which was maintained at Queen's Crawley. The cellars were filled with Burgundy then, the kennels with hounds, and the stables with gallant hunters. Now such horses as Queen's Crawley possessed went to plough, or ran in the Trafalgar coach, and it was with a team of these very horses, on an off day, that Miss Sharp was brought to the hall. For, boor as he was, Sir Pitt was a stickler for his dignity while at home, and seldom drove out but with 4 horses, and though he dined off boiled mutton, had always 3 footmen to serve it. If mere parsimony could have made a man rich, Sir Pitt Crawley might have become very wealthy. If he had been an attorney in a country town with no capital but his brains, it is very possible that he would have turned them to good account, and might have achieved for himself a very considerable influence and competency. But he was, unluckily, endowed with a good name, and a large, though encumbered, estate, both of which went rather to injure than to advance him. He had a taste for law, which cost him many thousands yearly, and being a great deal too clever to be robbed, as he said, by any single agent, allowed his affairs to be mismanaged by a dozen, whom he all equally mistrusted. He was such a sharp landlord that he could hardly find any but bankrupt tenants, and such a close farmer as to grudge almost the seed to the ground, whereupon revengeful nature grudged him the crops which she granted to more liberal husbandmen. He speculated in every possible way. He worked mines, bought canal shares, horsed coaches, took government contracts, and was the busiest man and magistrate of his county. As he would not pay honest agents at his granite quarry, he had the satisfaction of finding that 4 overseers ran away and took fortunes with them to America. For want of proper precautions, his coal mines filled with water. The government flung his contract of damaged beef upon his hands, and for his coach horses, every male proprietor in the kingdom knew that he lost more horses than any man in the country from underfeeding and buying cheap. In disposition he was sociable, and far from being proud. Nay, he rather preferred the society of a farmer or a horse dealer to that of a gentleman like my lord his son. He was fond of drink, of swearing, of joking with the farmers' daughters. He was never known to give away a shilling or to do a good action, but was of a pleasant, sly, laughing mood, and would cut his joke and drink his glass with a tenant, and sell him up the next day, or have his laugh with the poacher he was transporting, with equal good humour. His politeness for the fair sex has already been hinted at by Miss Rebecca Sharp. In a word, the whole baronetage, peerage, commonage of England did not contain a more cunning, mean, selfish, foolish, disreputable old man. That blood-red hand of Sir Pitt Crawley's would be in anybody's pocket except his own, and it is with grief and pain that as admirers of the British aristocracy we find ourselves obliged to admit the existence of so many ill qualities in a person whose name is in Debrett. One great cause why Mr. Crawley had such a hold over the affections of his father resulted from money arrangements. The baronet owed his son a sum of money out of the jointure of his mother, which he did not find it convenient to pay. Indeed, he had an almost invincible repugnance to paying anybody, and could only be brought by force to discharge his debts. Miss Sharp calculated, for she became, as we shall hear speedily, inducted into most of the secrets of the family, that the mere payment of his creditors cost the honourable baronet several hundred yearly. But this was a delight he could not forego. He had a savage pleasure in making the poor wretches wait, and in shifting from court to court and from term to term the period of satisfaction. "What's the good of being in Parliament," he said, "if you must pay your debts?" Hence, indeed, his position as a senator was not a little useful to him. Vanity Fair, Vanity Fair. Here was a man who could not spell and did not care to read, who had the habits and the cunning of a boor, whose aim in life was pettifogging, who never had a taste or emotion or enjoyment but what was sordid and foul. And yet he had rank and honours and power somehow, and was a dignitary of the land and a pillar of the state. He was high sheriff, and rode in a golden coach. Great ministers and statesmen courted him, and in Vanity Fair he had a higher place than the most brilliant genius or spotless virtue. Sir Pitt had an unmarried half-sister who inherited her mother's large fortune, and though the baronet proposed to borrow this money of her on mortgage, Miss Crawley declined the offer and preferred the security of the funds. She had signified, however, her intention of leaving her inheritance between Sir Pitt's second son and the family at the rectory, and had once or twice paid the debts of Rawdon Crawley in his career at college and in the army. Miss Crawley was, in consequence, an object of great respect when she came to Queen's Crawley, for she had a balance at her banker's which would have made her beloved anywhere. What a dignity it gives an old lady, that balance at the banker's! How tenderly we look at her faults if she is a relative, and may every reader have a score of such! What a kind, good-natured old creature we find her! How the junior partner of Hobbs and Dobbs leads her smiling to the carriage with the lozenge upon it, and the fat wheezy coachman! How, when she comes to pay us a visit, we generally find an opportunity to let our friends know her station in the world! We say, and with perfect truth, "I wish I had Miss MacWhirter's signature to a cheque for £5,000. She wouldn't miss it," says your wife. "She is my aunt," say you, in an easy, careless way, when your friend asks if Miss MacWhirter is any relative. Your wife is perpetually sending her little testimonies of affection. Your little girls work endless worsted baskets, cushions, and footstools for her. What a good fire there is in her room when she comes to pay you a visit, although your wife laces her stays without one. The house during her stay assumes a festive, neat, warm, jovial, snug appearance, not visible at other seasons. You yourself, dear sir, forget to go to sleep after dinner, and find yourself all of a sudden, though you invariably lose, very fond of a rubber. What good dinners you have! Game every day, Malmsey Madeira, and no end of fish from London. Even the servants in the kitchen share in the general prosperity, and somehow, during the stay of Miss MacWhirter's fat coachman, the beer is grown much stronger, and the consumption of tea and sugar in the nursery, where her maid takes her meals, is not regarded in the least. Is it so, or is it not so? I appeal to the middle classes. Ah, gracious powers, I wish you would send me an old aunt, a maiden aunt, an aunt with a lozenge on her carriage, and a front of light coffee-coloured hair. How my children should work work-bags for her, and my Julia and I would make her comfortable. Sweet, sweet vision, foolish, foolish dream. End of chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 10. Miss Sharp begins to make friends. And now, being received as a member of the amiable family whose portraits we have sketched in the foregoing pages, it became naturally Rebecca's duty to make herself, as she said, agreeable to her benefactors, and to gain their confidence to the utmost of her power. Who can but admire this quality of gratitude in an unprotected orphan? And if there entered some degree of selfishness into her calculations, who can say but that her prudence was perfectly justifiable? "I am alone in the world," said the friendless girl. "I have nothing to look for but what my own labor can bring me. And while that little pink-faced chit Amelia, with not half my sense, has £10,000 and an establishment secure. Poor Rebecca, and my figure is far better than hers, has only herself and her own wits to trust to. Well, let us see if my wits cannot provide me with an honourable maintenance, and if some day or the other I cannot show Miss Amelia my real superiority over her. Not that I dislike poor Amelia. Who can dislike such a harmless, good-natured creature? Only it will be a fine day when I can take my place above her in the world, as why indeed should I not? Thus it was that our little romantic friend formed visions of the future for herself. Nor must we be scandalized that in all her castles in the air a husband was the principal inhabitant. Of what else have young ladies to think but husbands? Of what else do their dear mammas think? I must be my own mamma, said Rebecca, not without a tingling consciousness of defeat as she thought over her little misadventure with Jos Sedley. So she wisely determined to render her position with the Queen's Crawley family comfortable and secure, and to this end resolved to make friends of everyone around her who could at all interfere with her comfort. As my Lady Crawley was not one of these personages, and a woman, moreover, so indolent and void of character as not to be of the least consequence in her own house, Rebecca soon found that it was not at all necessary to cultivate her goodwill. Indeed, impossible to gain it. She used to talk to her pupils about their poor mamma, and though she treated that lady with every demonstration of cool respect, it was to the rest of the family that she wisely directed the chief part of her attentions. With the young people, whose applause she thoroughly gained, her method was pretty simple. She did not pester their young brains with too much learning, but on the contrary let them have their own way in regard to educating themselves. For what instruction is more effectual than self-instruction? The eldest was rather fond of books, and as there was in the old library at Queen's Crawley a considerable provision of works of light literature of the last century, both in the French and English languages, they had been purchased by the secretary of the tape and sealing wax office at the period of his disgrace, and as nobody ever troubled the bookshelves but herself, Rebecca was enabled agreeably, and as it were in playing, to impart a great deal of instruction to Miss Rose Crawley. She and Miss Rose thus read together many delightful French and English works, among which may be mentioned those of the learned Dr. Smollett, of the ingenious Mr. Henry Fielding, of the graceful and fantastic Monsieur Crébillon the younger, whom our immortal poet Gray so much admired, and of the universal Monsieur de Voltaire. Once when Mr. Crawley asked what the young people were reading, the governess replied, "Smollett." "Oh, Smollett," said Mr. Crawley, quite satisfied. "His history is more dull, but by no means so dangerous as that of Mr. Hume. It is history you are reading?" "Yes," said Miss Rose, without however adding that it was the history of Mr. Humphrey Clinker. On another occasion he was rather scandalized at finding his sister with a book of French plays, but as the governess remarked that it was for the purpose of acquiring the French idiom in conversation, he was fain to be content. Mr. Crawley, as a diplomatist, was exceedingly proud of his own skill in speaking the French language, for he was of the world still, and not a little pleased with the compliments which the governess continually paid him upon his proficiency. Miss Violet's tastes were, on the contrary, more rude and boisterous than those of her sister. She knew the sequestered spots where the hens laid their eggs. She could climb a tree to rob the nests of the feathered songsters of their speckled spoils. And her pleasure was to ride the young colts, and to scour the plains like Camilla. She was the favourite of her father and of the stablemen. She was the darling and withal the terror of the cook, for she discovered the haunts of the jam-pots, and would attack them when they were within her reach. She and her sister were engaged in constant battles, any of which peccadilloes, if Miss Sharp discovered, she did not tell them to Lady Crawley, who would have told them to the father, or worse, to Mr. Crawley, but promised not to tell, if Miss Violet would be a good girl and love her governess. With Mr. Crawley, Miss Sharp was respectful and obedient. She used to consult him on passages of French which she could not understand, though her mother was a Frenchwoman, and which he would construe to her satisfaction. And besides giving her his aid in profane literature, he was kind enough to select for her books of a more serious tendency, and address to her much of his conversation. She admired beyond measure his speech at the Quashimaboo Aid Society, took an interest in his pamphlet on malt, was often affected even to tears by his discourses of an evening, and would say, "Oh, thank you, sir," with a sigh and a look up to heaven that made him occasionally condescend to shake hands with her. "Blood is everything, after all," would that aristocratic religionist say. "How Miss Sharp is awakened by my words, when not one of the people here is touched! I am too fine for them, too delicate. I must familiarize my style. But she understands it. Her mother was a Montmorency." Indeed, it was from this famous family, as it appears, that Miss Sharp, by the mother's side, was descended. Of course, she did not say that her mother had been on the stage. It would have shocked Mr. Crawley's religious scruples. How many noble émigrés had this horrid revolution plunged in poverty? She had several stories about her ancestors, ere she had been many months in the house, some of which Mr. Crawley happened to find in Dozier's dictionary, which was in the library, and which strengthened his belief in their truth, and in the high breeding of Rebecca. Are we to suppose from this curiosity and prying into dictionaries, could our heroine suppose, that Mr. Crawley was interested in her? No, only in a friendly way. Have we not stated that he was attached to Lady Jane Sheepshanks? He took Rebecca to task once or twice about the propriety of playing at backgammon with Sir Pitt, saying that it was a godless amusement, and that she would be much better engaged in reading Thrump's Legacy, or The Blind Washerwoman of Moorfields, or any work of a more serious nature. But Miss Sharp said her dear mother used often to play the same game with the old Count de Tric-Trac and the venerable Abbé du Cornet, and so found an excuse for this and other worldly amusements. But it was not only by playing at backgammon with the baronet that the little governess rendered herself agreeable to her employer. She found many different ways of being useful to him. She read over with indefatigable patience all those law papers with which, before she came to Queen's Crawley, he had promised to entertain her. She volunteered to copy many of his letters, and adroitly altered the spelling of them so as to suit the usages of the present day. She became interested in everything appertaining to the estate, to the farm, the park, the garden, and the stables, and so delightful a companion was she, that the baronet would seldom take his after-breakfast walk without her, and the children, of course, when she would give her advice as to the trees which were to be lopped in the shrubberies, the garden beds to bed up, the crops which were to be cut, the horses which were to go to cart or plough. Before she had been a year at Queen's Crawley, she had quite won the baronet's confidence, and the conversation at the dinner-table, which before used to be held between him and Mr. Horrocks the butler, was now almost exclusively between Sir Pitt and Miss Sharp. She was almost mistress of the house when Mr. Crawley was absent, but conducted herself in her new and exalted situation with such circumspection and modesty as not to offend the authorities of the kitchen and stable, among whom her behaviour was always exceedingly modest and affable. She was quite a different person from the haughty, shy, dissatisfied little girl whom we have known previously, and this change of temper proved great prudence, a sincere desire of amendment, or, at any rate, great moral courage on her part. Whether it was the heart which dictated this new system of complaisance and humility adopted by our Rebecca is to be proved by her after history. A system of hypocrisy which lasts through whole years is one seldom satisfactorily practised by a person of 21. However, our readers will recollect that though young in years, our heroine was old in life and experience, and we have written to no purpose if they have not discovered that she was a very clever woman. The elder and younger son of the house of Crawley were, like the gentleman and lady in the weather-box, never at home together. They hated each other cordially. Indeed, Rawdon Crawley, the dragoon, had a great contempt for the establishment altogether, and seldom came thither except when his aunt paid her annual visit. The great good quality of this old lady has been mentioned. She possessed £70,000, and had almost adopted Rawdon. She disliked her elder nephew exceedingly, and despised him as a milksop. In return, he did not hesitate to state that her soul was irretrievably lost, and was of opinion that his brother's chance in the next world was not a whit better. "She is a godless woman of the world," would Mr. Crawley say. "She lives with atheists and Frenchmen. My mind shudders when I think of her awful, awful situation, and that, near as she is to the grave, she should be so given up to vanity, licentiousness, profaneness, and folly." In fact, the old lady declined altogether to hear his hour's lecture of an evening, and when she came to Queen's Crawley alone, he was obliged to pretermit his usual devotional exercises. "Shut up your sermons, Pitt, when Miss Crawley comes down," said his father. "She is written to say that she won't stand the preachifying." "Oh, sir, consider the servants." "The servants be hanged," said Sir Pitt. And his son thought even worse would happen were they deprived of the benefit of his instruction. "Why, hang it, Pitt," said the father to his remonstrance, "you wouldn't be such a flat as to let 3,000 a year go out the family?" "What is money compared to our souls, sir?" continued Mr. Crawley. "You mean the old lady won't leave the money to you?" And who knows but it was Mr. Crawley's meaning? Old Miss Crawley was certainly one of the reprobate. She had a snug little house in Park Lane, and as she ate and drank a great deal too much during the season in London, she went to Harrogate or Cheltenham for the summer. She was the most hospitable and jovial of old Vestals, and had been a beauty in her day, she said. All old women were beauties once, we very well know. She was a bel esprit and a dreadful radical for those days. She had been in France, where Saint-Just, they say, inspired her with an unfortunate passion, and loved ever after French novels, French cookery, and French wines. She read Voltaire and had Rousseau by heart, talked very lightly about divorce, and most energetically of the rights of women. She had pictures of Mr. Fox in every room in the house. When that statesman was in opposition, I am not sure that she had not flung a main with him, and when he came into office, she took great credit for bringing over to him Sir Pitt and his colleague for Queen's Crawley, although Sir Pitt would have come over himself without any trouble on the honest lady's part. It is needless to say that Sir Pitt was brought to change his views after the death of the great Whig statesman. This worthy old lady took a fancy to Rawdon Crawley when a boy, sent him to Cambridge, in opposition to his brother at Oxford, and when the young man was requested by the authorities of the first-named university to quit, after a residence of 2 years, she bought him his commission in the Life Guards Green. A perfect and celebrated blood or dandy about town was this young officer. Boxing, rat-hunting, the fives court, and four-in-hand driving were then the fashion of our British aristocracy, and he was an adept in all these noble sciences. And though he belonged to the household troops, who, as it was their duty to rally round the Prince Regent, had not shown their valour in foreign service yet, Rawdon Crawley had already, apropos of play, of which he was immoderately fond, fought 3 bloody duels, in which he gave ample proofs of his contempt for death. "And for what follows after death," would Mr. Crawley observe, throwing his gooseberry-coloured eyes up to the ceiling. He was always thinking of his brother's soul, or of the souls of those who differed with him in opinion. It is a sort of comfort which many of the serious give themselves. Silly, romantic Miss Crawley, far from being horrified at the courage of her favourite, always used to pay his debts after his duels, and would not listen to a word that was whispered against his morality. "He will sow his wild oats," she would say, "and is worth far more than that puling hypocrite of a brother of his." End of chapter 10.